Welcome to episode 57 of the Hail Married podcast. I'm Atoves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back to preview the season opener against Houston. Let's get started. So we got our first depth chart that came out this week. Any thoughts or surprises from that?
A lot of it on the offensive line. We started out with the predictions I had last week, which said, I'm not really sure that the offensive line can stay healthy, and already 2 injuries to the offensive line. First, Payne Hebert wasn't on the depth chart.
Mm-hmm.
He's been out with injury, as Coach Traylor said. And then Ben Rios, who was supposed to be one of the tackles, again, also out. So, already got some injuries happening. Again, have depth, so maybe not going to be as much of an issue. But it did start sprinkling in different names. Not that I think that Payne Hebert or Ben Rios were going to be starters, but I think they might have shown up on the 2 deep early on. We'll say that Walker Beatty, starting at left tackle, talented guy. I had asked Jared from the Alamo Audible last season, what do you think of him? And, he pretty much said, look, it's going to take quite a bit to get him out of the 2 deep moving forward. And he's right. And here he is starting. Obviously had a great camp, obviously impressed the coaches. He's going to be one of the guys that's in charge of protecting our prized player, right, Frank?
Right.
So, overall, I think that's the offensive line looks good. I haven't seen any issues, but again, want to watch to see if there's any injuries that occur during the game and see if hopefully my prediction doesn't come true. But again, one of the things that you always want to worry about, right? The other thing was notice Ty Leonard, third on the depth chart at nose tackle. Kind of seems to me like he's going to be sort of a quick guy that you bring in on third down. But I don't know. Maybe he won't really see the field that much. But again, Traylor's been talking about the fact that there's been a lot of guys that have had good camps, and because of it, he wants to reward them by getting them on the field.
Right.
And because of that, maybe that's why Ty Leonard's on there. And, Ty Leonard may offer a different look, and it's good. You don't always want just big guys coming up, and even though we have some speed on that defensive line, forcing the Houston offensive line to have to deal with, maybe, I know it's going to sound funny to say a lighter guy,
Yeah.
He's only 275. Yeah, I know. But yeah, given different looks, obviously helps this UTSA defense dominate during games. Other than that, did you see anything on your end?
Yeah, I had shared my concerns that middle linebacker was one of the positions I had a question mark at, and that question really, I guess, didn't get answered because Avery Morris was listed as an or with Duron Allman. So don't exactly know who's going to be, the true starter. Probably going to have to wait another game or two to see who, really steps up between those two. And then kicker, Traylor said would be decided right before the game. So that's kind of interesting. Again, not really sure who's going to be handling kickoffs and then who's going to be handling field goals. Anticipating that this is going to be a close game, that again is still a question mark.
Well, at least it's not quarterback that's going to be decided right before the game.
Sure,
a la
that's true.
Frank Wilson. So I think we're good there, all right?
Right.
No need to really go over or mull over what happened last season. It was a really tough loss in the Alamo Dome for this UTSA team. Out of the two losses they had in the season, this one stung.
Right.
Let's get to this Houston Cougar preview. Start out on the offensive side of the ball. They lost 7 key starters, one of them being their starting quarterback, Clayton Tune. He's in line actually to start for the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah.
Great for him. Kind of cool to be able to say, hey, look, we took a starting NFL quarterback to the limit last season. Now, again, I don't know if he actually starts. He may be a backup, but either way.
The fact that he is on the roster and definitely has an opportunity to see the field is pretty impressive.
Right. Another big loss, of course, was Nathaniel Tank Dell. Dell, while he was touted to be this big game breaker, UTSA defense really kept wraps on him last season. So, other than that, I think the other big name here that is missing outside of 3 linemen, I think it's 2 offensive linemen that aren't returning, is a running back, and that's Alton McCaskill. He was supposed to be the everything guy for this Houston Cougar offense. He transferred over to Colorado with prime time.
Yeah, and that was definitely a surprise to the coaching staff in the spring.
Right. So even with all these losses, though, they still anticipate this offense being stronger than the defense. Kind of makes me laugh. Not because I think that this offense won't have its moments. We'll get into what we think is going to happen in this game a little bit later. But tell us about some of the returning players.
Yeah, so interesting. And another one that, going into fall camp that they thought was going to be one of their key players was running back freshman Rayshawn Sanford. But he ended up getting injured and will be out for the season. So they do have a running back, Stacy Sneed, who's returning. And then they also have a transfer, Tony Mathis, who came in from West Virginia. Really what you're looking at in the running back position is running back by committee. You could see 2, 3, 4 guys on the field. Their wide receivers, they do have 2 key returners. One is sophomore Matthew Golden. The other one is sophomore Joseph Manjack. Both of them saw the field against UTSA. Matthew Golden is supposed to be the person who's really going to take over for Tank Dell. They have really high hopes for him. They think he's going to make a big jump this season, so he's definitely somebody to keep an eye on. But I think the interesting part with this is going to be, do these guys really have the chemistry with the new quarterback, Donovan Smith? And, that's something that was talked quite a bit about between Clayton Tune and Tank Dell last year was their chemistry. We've talked about that a lot with Frank and the wide receivers. So it'll be interesting to see how they play in this first game.
Which brings us to the key player on the offensive side, which is quarterback Donovan Smith. Donovan Smith, who is a transfer from Texas Tech, actually beat Houston last season in Lubbock. Look, I've watched him play. I kind of told Atos, it reminds me of like a really poor man's Vince Young. Just because of the fact that he's a big guy, definitely going to be hard to tackle, but leaves a lot to be asked for in terms of passing. So much so that certainly I think is going to become quite the question if he can get hot or not within this game against UTSA. Based on what you've seen in terms of Donovan Smith and what we've kind of talked about, do you think that he can get it together against UTSA?
I don't think so, not in this game. And look, there's a reason why Donovan Smith is not the starting quarterback at Texas Tech. He's had 2 really great opportunities to come in and take over for injuries at Tech, but he wasn't able to keep that job. And part of the reason was he has a turnover problem. And while, he fancies himself this dual threat quarterback, part of the reason why I think he likes to consider himself that way is because he's just not as comfortable in the passing game. Some stats from last year, he had 12 touchdowns to 8 interceptions. And his career overall, he's got 19 touchdowns to 10 interceptions. Those really aren't great stats.
No.
And, I think that's going to be something that you'll likely see in this first game because, again, not a lot of time to build that chemistry with, his wide receivers or his tight ends.
Yeah, not to say that he won't have moments, like I said before. But if we can limit those moments, I think, this obviously goes a different way in terms of the game. We'll get to that prediction here pretty shortly. Real quick, their special teams leaves a lot to be desired. They're pretty much in the same position as UTSA, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're returning a long snapper and a punter, but then they have a new kicker. And ironically, their kicker is also from Alabama. Chase Allen, one of the 2 potential kickers for UTSA, is from Alabama. So sort of interesting that you kind of have those parallels there.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned some of the similarities of UTSA and Houston as we kind of were going through some of this preview. And certainly you look at some of the things you get to replace on offense, sort of a top receiver. UTSA has to, has to replace a top receiver too. And just those gaps that you have throughout, both sides of the ball. But let's get to probably one of the more important sides of the ball that's going to be here for either team, and that's going to be on defense. Houston lost 5 of their starters from last season. Key thing here, though, is they lost 8 of their 9 top tacklers from last season. That's not nothing. That defense last season really predicated itself on its defensive line dominance, and it really held this UTSA run game quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something there that you have to kind of point at, that they have to start moving some players around just to fill some of these gaps, especially on the line. Tell us about some of those returning players.
Yeah, so one of the key returners that they have is their nose guard, Chidozie Wanaku. I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, sorry. But then they have an interesting addition on the D-line, and that's this kid from Oklahoma, David Ugwabu. He actually was a linebacker at Oklahoma, and he's transferred to Houston partially because he wanted to go back to playing on the defensive end. So he's played at defensive end previously, but Oklahoma wanted to keep him as a linebacker. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of impact he has, but there's very high expectations that he is going to be able to really step up and be an impact player like Derek Parrish and DeAnthony Jones were last year. They've also transferred in Brandon Mack from Ole Miss. But then they also have very high expectations for their edge rusher, Nelson Caesar. He was a pivotal part of the defense last year against UTSA, although he overall only had 4 sacks for the season. So again, high expectations for him. So it'd be interesting to see really where he can take his game to. Some of their places where they were trying to really kind of increase the depth on their defense were their secondary. They were one of the worst in the country last year. They did add a safety that they brought in from New Mexico, Adari Halsey. They've also have a weakness at linebacker. They do have a couple of returners at linebacker, but then they've brought in a transfer, Ish Smith from A&M. So it's sort of interesting. I think the secondary, again, is going to be a weakness as well as the linebackers. So really the strength of the Houston defense is going to come down to that D-line.
I think it's going to be an interesting transition for them. And, it's always tough to transition from being a stand-up linebacker to going, essentially putting your hand in the ground. So certainly something to look for during the game, see if they start even making further changes, right? Like, do they decide that maybe it's just not working out on the line, right? Mm-hmm. So who knows? But I do want to call out is, for me, who might be one of the key players here is Tremarcus Cheeks. He is the Mike linebacker. And let me tell you why, as we go into now our game prediction and our keys to victory. The matchup to watch, I think, for me right now is Tremarcus Cheeks versus Kavorian Barnes. You said that the linebacker is going to be their weakness. If you can't have guys chase down a running back, you're going to have to depend on that line to essentially dominate UTSA's offensive line. With so many new guys coming in, I think that was easier said last year because they had a talented defensive line. This year with so many more questions and what I think is a better, much more talented UTSA offensive line, I feel like that tips the scales for UTSA. And this really puts more pressure on the linebackers. In particular, Cheeks, who, like I said, is the middle linebacker and will probably have to be trying to track down here Barnes. And I just, for me right now, I don't see it happening. Cheeks had about 40 tackles last season. He'd still ranked about, I think it was 13 or 12 on, the overall tacklers for defense. It's going to be difficult, I think, for Houston to get UTSA onto the sidelines. Because really what UTSA is going to have to do here is make sure they continue to stack some yards. I think, again, try to be a little more methodical, especially looking back. We've talked about how they may be in 12 personnel. So not looking to really spread out, I think, Houston like they did last year when, we really didn't have much of a game breaker at running back. Traylon Smith led our rushing attack last year with 13 rushes for 34, 39 yards. wasn't much.
Right.
And he's known as a speed back, right? So therein really gets you the need for this running game to get going. And I think you can do it with the 12 personnel. But overall, what we're trying to get to here is we need efficient execution. You can't afford to waste drives. That's exactly what happened last year. And, I know that there was some mistakes during the game, particularly you can put it on mute or do whatever as I remind you that we had 12 men on the field on a key punt return, which gave Houston a first down. And essentially, the momentum sort of shift. And, after that, UTSA really started wasting a lot of drives. Couldn't put anything together. You can get off mute now. But on the defensive side, I think the matchup to watch is their offensive tackle, their star offensive tackle, who happens to be their left tackle, Patrick Paul, versus our one and only Trey Moore. It's going to be a key matchup. Obviously, you're going pretty much strength on strength. The thing is, one of the weaknesses for Patrick Paul is the fact that if he doesn't lock up on a player, then he has problems with, I would say, his footwork, but really trying to regain his balance. So how does he recover after, let's say Trey starts going right around him? If Trey can, make a move right around him, it's going to be tough for Paul to really have any success. And if Paul's having issues with Trey Moore, that means Donovan Smith is going to get more pressured.
Yeah.
So we're looking at sort of a havoc there.
And one of the interesting things we didn't mention about Patrick Paul in the offensive section is that he is somebody they're talking about right now as a potential first-round draft pick next year. So, he really is going to be the key to that offensive line.
Yeah, and again, if he neutralizes Trey Moore, it might be a little bit longer game for us, or we're going to have to figure out how to pressure the other members of that offensive line. With that, I think it's going to be key for this UTSA defense to win the line of scrimmage. We've talked about it off the podcast. That's been our thing, is if we can win the line of scrimmage, both sides of the ball, I think this UTSA team just continues to roll. I don't think they have as many issues. But the other thing is, and I know AHS is going to cringe here when I say this, but they have to stay disciplined.
Right.
A lot of it is, yes, you have to tackle well, but they got to keep themselves out of that trash talking with with the offensive players. They lost their cool plenty of times against Troy, and that was really I would say a matchup between two teams that were pretty evenly matched. If not, UTSA had more talent than Troy, yet Troy won because they didn't lose their cool. Mm-hmm. Houston really tries to think that they're so much more talented than UTSA, when in reality you look at both teams across the board. I would say at best they are marginally better than UTSA in terms of talent, and that's not a knock on Houston. That's more just saying UTSA has really closed the gap, and Houston still has a lot to build on when it comes to becoming a true P5, especially jumping from what was really an average, or maybe slightly above average G5 team last season. So, let's get to our predictions.
All right.
Look, I've said it all the way since our way too early predictions back in the spring. I said it again last week when we did dropped our preview. But UTSA always starts out strong in the first game of the season in each of the first three trailer football seasons. You had Texas State in 2020, started strong. Once again, against Illinois, started strong. Last season, arguably, it started strong. They made mistakes, didn't win, but they still started really strong. No one has to tell me that UTSA has a target on their back. I think these guys, not only do they know it, I think they relish it. Mm-hmm. As much as we talk about the fact that they like being they don't like being called underdogs, they're not going to get underestimated. I think they like the fact that now they've got that target on their back, and I think that they're using that as motivation. This Houston team, as I said, is pretty talented, but I think UTSA is catching them at the right time of the season, as you alluded to a little bit earlier in our episode. I see Kavorian having a big game. I think he's going to do well, and I think one of the young wide receivers, I don't know which one, I'm just throwing it out there. Right. One of the young wide receivers steps up, has a big game. And I think that, Trey Moore, ends up winning the battle against Patrick Paul, I'm not going to say it's just overwhelms him, but I think he's going to do enough to win that battle. Because of it, that means that UTSA is going to win that line of scrimmage. I think Donovan Smith is still going to put up some points. It's going to be enough. Give me UTSA 34-31 over Houston.
All right. I think because Houston has had to replace so much key talent on both sides of the ball, and they're relying so much on these P5 transfers, and while these guys are talented, this team hasn't played together, and they haven't played together in the field at all.
Right.
So, I think one of the things that we've learned from watching UTSA is that it really comes down to how you operate together as a team. And you could argue from UTSA that as a team, we are better than the sum of our parts. I think UTSA has the advantage because we have the experienced core group of veterans on both offense and defense. And if ever there was a time to beat Houston, it's now. While I expect that we're going to have some mistakes because it's week one and you always have mistakes in week one, I agree with you. I think our defense is going to win in the trenches. I think our offense is going to win in the trenches, but I think particularly defense is going to win in the trenches. They're going to put pressure on Donovan Smith, and as we've seen with Donovan Smith, that will force him to make mistakes and make some turnovers. I think we'll be more successful in the run game this year than we were last year, and our combination of experienced wide receivers and tight ends are going to really challenge a weak Houston secondary. So I think once again, UTSA owns TDECU. Give me UTSA 38-31.
Woo! Let's go. Starting out, want to know both sides.
All right, before we go, let's talk about the soccer team and the wonderful start to the season that they've had so far.
Oh, those wonderful ladies. I could gush about them for, I don't know, probably a couple hours in terms of a podcast episode. But, that would just be so many problems to edit. Because I'm sure it would just be me rambling just like I am now. Look, I'll say this. I said it multiple times. This is a talented team. The way Coach Pittman has constructed this team and the way they're moving the ball around has been terrific. They ran into some problems against Kansas State, but in their first two games, they were fine. They moved the ball around. They created some opportunities, but, I think, again, much like the football team, much like, volleyball team, some early season struggles, just trying to figure out where everybody's at, trying to figure out how these different teams are going to defend you. And, you have, goalies that, stepped up. And so because of it, they start out the first four games 3-1. Only loss was to Kansas State. I'll say this about Kansas State. Even though they're a quote-unquote P5, there's nothing about them that told me that they were light years better than UTSA. And I was expecting them to be better, but I didn't think that they would really capitalize. And I think there was sort of an issue in terms of not really subbing enough at the end of the first half. It was a really hot day. And because of it, we got worn down. And in getting worn down, kind of gave up a couple of tough goals. The second one, which was actually fantastic from the Kansas State player. I don't know that there's many goalies, if any, out there that are going to stop it. And we've got a pretty great goalie in terms of Mia Krasinski.
And there were a number of shots on goal. So if she wasn't as good as she is, the score would have been much higher than it was.
Right. So with that, there's still a lot to build on. I think Coach Pittman knows that. The team knows that. And look, like I said right now about Mia Krasinski, she's still been a rock in the goal. She's done terrific. But I gotta have this soft spot for Sophie Morin. She's absolutely a star. She's our freshman midfielder, and man, she has really done a great job moving off the ball. She's just, I said it before to Coach Pittman, and it just keeps coming out more and more. She is certainly very composed when she gets the ball. She's just different out there, and you notice it. It pops when you see her kind of get the ball and just look confident in the way she handles it. Because of it, it's given her an opportunity to see the field. And look, she's just done a great job of just passing into space. And, but look, I'll say the entire offense, I get that they really haven't been able to put in some goals against, Texas State or Kansas State, but it's coming. There's still, again, some work to do there. But again, we got to remember, we've been missing Marley Frey, one of the veterans from last season. She took a knock in one of the exhibition games. She hasn't been able to come back yet, but I would assume that they're just kind of being precautionary with her and just letting her get back. Midfielder Jordan Highland got injured during the Kansas State game. She was held out against Texas State. And then Sabrina Hillier also, I think, took a bit of a knock against Kansas State. It was tough because all of a sudden we had some two key injuries there. And so, I had to do a little bit of shuffling there. But overall, things I think are looking up. This team is going to do some damage. And then they've got two more opportunities here that you can see them. Thursday night, you're going to see them at 9 p.m. against Grand Canyon. And then on Sunday, they're going to be at California Baptist. Both games on the road, but definitely a chance to see these ladies do some magic on the field.
Yeah, and both games should be on ESPN+. So, talked a little bit about the fact that the NFL 53-man roster was going to be coming out. So, the final rosters have been decided. 4 former UTSA football players are on those rosters. Spencer Burford, Marcus Davenport, Kevin Strong, and Tariq Woolen. Marcus Davenport this year is with the Vikings. And Kevin Strong this year is with the Cardinals. And then Leroy Watson, Sincere McCormick, and Eric Banks are now on the practice squads. Leroy Watson is with the 49ers, Sincere McCormick with the Raiders, and Eric Banks with the Cardinals. And then one last thing, if you haven't read Mike Craven's article on Frank's injury this spring, got to put it on your must-read list. He did an incredible article talking about the injury that Frank had last year, the surgery that he had after the end of the season, and kind of what had gone wrong with that. And really went into a lot of depth about Frank's journey to come back this season. It will definitely help you to feel much more grateful about Frank coming back this year and appreciate the fact that we do have him back this season as our quarterback. So again, if you haven't read it, you can find that on Twitter.
Yeah, it is an absolutely great article. Mike Finger had an article today, too, from the Express News, had one. Craven's definitely is a little more insightful. Finger, though, kind of hits you more in the feels. So, just so you know.
All right, well, I think that about wraps it up for us. So thank you for joining us on the Hail Mary podcast. I'm A-Tobes.
And I'm the Tobes.
We'll be back to recap that victory over Houston.
Birds up.